There is a very specific kind of relief that some people only feel when they are finally alone. The door closes, the room becomes quiet, and suddenly the body softens, as if it has been holding tension all day without permission to let go. What makes this confusing is that nothing obviously bad happened beforehand. Nobody was cruel. No argument took place. The conversations were normal. The atmosphere seemed fine, and yet the nervous system never fully relaxed. That is the part most people misunderstand. This is not simply introversion or a harmless preference for silence. There is a deep difference between someone who enjoys solitude and someone whose body only feels safe when no one else is present. Around people, their nervous system stays slightly alert, quietly reading expressions, tone, energy, and emotional shifts without even realizing it. The body keeps preparing for tension that may never come because somewhere in the past, unpredictability once mattered. Over time, this constant emotional scanning becomes exhausting. Then solitude arrives, and for the first time all day, the monitoring stops. There is nobody left to read, no emotional atmosphere left to manage, no invisible pressure left to anticipate. The body finally exhales completely. That feeling is why solitude becomes so emotionally important. It is not loneliness. It is the rare experience of feeling safe enough to fully rest inside your own nervous system. The first trait the video explores lies deep inside the nervous system. Some people grow up in environments where emotions feel unpredictable and difficult to trust. The atmosphere in the house could change before anyone even spoke. A parent's mood might suddenly shift. Love could feel warm one moment and distant the next. Safety was never completely stable, so the child's nervous system learned something important very early: stay alert. It began constantly scanning the environment for emotional signals, reading facial expressions, tones of voice, body language, and subtle changes in energy in order to predict what might happen next. This is not paranoia. It is a highly intelligent survival response developed by a nervous system trying to protect itself from unpredictability. The problem is that the body does not automatically stop using this response once childhood ends. The scanning continues long after the original environment is gone. It follows the person into adulthood, into friendships, relationships, workplaces, and even spaces that are objectively safe. Around other people, there is often a quiet tension beneath the surface, a low, continuous readiness that never fully turns off. The nervous system stays partially braced even when no danger exists. This is why some people feel emotionally exhausted after ordinary social interaction even when nothing negative happened. Their body was working the entire time, monitoring, adjusting, anticipating. Then they finally become alone, and something inside immediately softens. The scanning stops. The emotional monitoring quiets down. The body no longer has to predict anyone's reactions or prepare for emotional shifts. For the first time all day, the nervous system feels safe enough to completely relax. That is why solitude feels so much deeper than preference. For some people, it feels like the only place where survival finally gets to rest. Another trait the video explores is something psychology calls high self-monitoring, the unconscious habit of constantly adjusting yourself around other people. Individuals with this pattern are not fake or manipulative. Most of the time, they do not even realize they are doing it. The moment someone enters the room, their nervous system automatically begins reading the emotional atmosphere. They notice tone, facial expressions, subtle shifts in energy, and unspoken expectations, then instinctively reshape parts of themselves to fit the situation. Around one person, they become softer, around another quieter, around someone else more agreeable or emotionally restrained. They continuously adapt the way they speak, react, express emotion, and even how much of their real personality they allow to surface. Because this process happens automatically, many people never recognize how exhausting it truly is. Beneath every interaction, there is an invisible layer of management constantly running in the background. Part of the mind keeps asking questions like, what does this person need from me right now? Should I say less? Should I hide this feeling? Should I become easier to handle? Each adjustment may seem small on its own, but over time, the emotional cost accumulates. After dozens of conversations and interactions, Many people are left feeling strangely drained without understanding why. The exhaustion does not come from socializing itself. It comes from never fully being able to relax into their natural state around others. Then solitude arrives, and something inside finally loosens. There is nobody left to read, nobody left to adapt around, nobody left to emotionally calculate for. The version of themselves that exists without performance slowly returns. Their thoughts feel clearer, their emotions feel more honest, and their body no longer carries the invisible tension of maintaining a social version of who they are. That is why being alone often feels less like isolation and more like finally returning home to themselves. The video emphasizes an important truth. Nobody is born feeling safer alone than with people. That feeling is learned through experience. Somewhere in a person's history, closeness became connected to pain often enough that the nervous system began treating emotional distance as protection. Maybe they trusted someone deeply and discovered that trust was unsafe. Maybe they opened up emotionally and felt dismissed, misunderstood, or quietly ignored. Maybe they genuinely needed someone during an important moment and found that the other person was physically present but emotionally unreachable in the ways that mattered most. Experiences like these may seem small on their own, but the nervous system records them carefully. Over time, it begins forming unconscious conclusions about how relationships work. One of the strongest conclusions it can form is this: closeness involves risk. The more emotionally important someone becomes, the greater the possibility of disappointment, inconsistency, rejection, or pain. Solitude, on the other hand, promises nothing. And because it promises nothing, it cannot betray you. This is why people with this pattern often feel calmer alone, even when they deeply long for connection. Their nervous system has learned that emotional safety exists more reliably in solitude than in dependency on other people. The difficult part is that these conclusions often survive long after the original pain is gone. Even when kind and emotionally safe people enter their life, part of them remains slightly guarded, slightly braced, for something to eventually go wrong. The body quietly prepares for disappointment before disappointment has even happened. Not because they do not want intimacy, but because experience taught them how painful intimacy can become once someone matters enough. This creates a painful inner conflict. A part of them wants closeness, warmth, and emotional connection, while another part remains cautious because it remembers what vulnerability once cost. They do not avoid people because they feel nothing. In many cases, they avoid closeness because they feel too much. Another trait the video explores is an unusually deep level of emotional sensitivity and absorption. People like this do not simply participate in social interaction the way most others do. They absorb it. They notice emotional undercurrents that are never spoken aloud, subtle shifts in energy that most people overlook, tension hidden beneath ordinary conversations, and feelings that even the people experiencing them may not fully recognize themselves. A conversation that someone else forgets an hour later may remain inside their mind for the rest of the day. They replay details, think about pauses in tone, emotional inconsistencies, or changes in atmosphere that nobody else seemed to notice. Because their nervous system processes interaction at such a deep emotional level, ordinary social experiences become far more intense internally than they appear externally. Over time, this creates emotional saturation. It is not simple tiredness. It is the feeling of carrying too much emotional information inside the body at once. After spending time around people, especially emotionally complicated environments, they often feel mentally crowded, overstimulated, and unable to fully relax until they are alone again. This is why solitude does not feel like a luxury for them. It feels necessary. Their nervous system requires silence and distance in order to recover from the amount of emotional input constantly being absorbed from the world around them. Many people misunderstand this and assume they are antisocial or emotionally distant. But the reality is often the opposite. They are feeling too much, noticing too much, processing too deeply. Their exhaustion comes not from lack of care, but from an overwhelming amount of unconscious emotional processing happening beneath the surface all the time. Solitude becomes the place where all of that finally settles, and the nervous system can slowly return to balance again. Many people who feel safest alone did not grow up completely isolated. In fact, they often grew up surrounded by people physically while feeling deeply alone emotionally. There may have always been family in the house, voices in the background, daily routines continuing normally, yet the emotional connection they truly needed rarely felt fully available. They learned very early that being physically near others did not necessarily mean feeling emotionally safe, understood, or comforted, so they adapted. They learned how to entertain themselves, how to think quietly inside their own mind, how to soothe their own emotions, and how to build an inner world rich enough to survive inside when the outer world could not consistently meet their emotional needs. Over time, solitude stopped feeling like absence and started feeling like stability. It became the emotional baseline their nervous system trusted more than connection itself. Being alone was no longer simply being by yourself. It became the one place where the body could finally lower its defenses completely without needing to anticipate disappointment, emotional distance, or unpredictability. This is something many people misunderstand. They assume a person who prefers solitude must dislike people or lack the ability to connect. But often, the opposite is true. These individuals usually learned solitude not because they hated closeness, but because closeness did not always feel emotionally reliable. Depending too heavily on others once carried uncertainty, inconsistency, or emotional loneliness, so the nervous system slowly began treating self-reliance as safety. Even years later, the imprint remains. A quiet room and time alone often feel safer than emotional dependence on another person ever fully did. For many people, the most authentic version of themselves only fully appears in solitude. When no one else is around, something inside them finally relaxes. They no longer have to monitor reactions, adjust their tone, soften their emotions, or quietly reshape themselves to fit the emotional atmosphere around other people. The mind becomes calmer, more honest, and more open. Thoughts begin to surface that rarely appear in social environments. Feelings become clearer, deeper, and more emotionally real. The video describes this as developing a rich private self and inner world so emotionally layered and psychologically alive that the outside social world often feels like a translation that can never fully capture who they truly are. Many people with this trait do not consciously recognize it at first. They simply notice that the version of themselves that exists alone feels more genuine than the version that appears around others. In social situations, parts of their personality often become filtered, softened, hidden, or reduced automatically. But in solitude, those hidden parts finally have space to exist completely. This is why being alone often feels emotionally meaningful rather than simply peaceful. It becomes the only environment where the self does not need to fragment or perform in order to remain emotionally safe. The video emphasizes that this is not pathology. It is not proof that something is wrong with them socially. It is an adaptation developed over time by a mind that learned to turn inward because the external world did not always feel emotionally safe enough to fully open toward. When vulnerability once carried risk, the inner world became a refuge. Over time, that refuge grew richer, deeper, and more emotionally honest than many external relationships ever managed to become. Solitude became the place where the most real parts of the self were finally allowed to exist, without being edited into something easier for the world to accept. When people like this are alone, their mind does not simply become quieter. It begins operating at an entirely different depth. Their thoughts slow down, expand, and move into emotional territory that most ordinary conversations never reach. Instead of thinking in quick social responses, they follow ideas all the way to their emotional core. They reflect on patterns, contradictions, hidden meanings, and uncomfortable truths without cutting the process short just to keep things socially comfortable. In solitude, there is finally enough psychological space for their mind to unfold completely. Over time, however, many of these individuals begin realizing something painful. Most people do not process experience at this depth. Most conversations remain on the surface because deeper emotional complexity often makes others uncomfortable. This creates a growing gap between internal complexity and external expression. Their inner world becomes rich, layered, emotionally detailed, and intensely reflective, while the outside world often feels too fast or too limited to fully hold it. After enough experiences of opening up and feeling misunderstood, dismissed, or emotionally unseen, many slowly stop trying to bring others fully into their inner world. Not because they believe they are superior, but because repeatedly translating profound thoughts into smaller, simpler versions becomes exhausting. They begin learning that certain parts of themselves only survive intact in solitude. Alone, they no longer have to interrupt a thought halfway through because it is too much. They no longer have to reduce emotional complexity into something easier for others to digest. Their mind is finally allowed to exist at its natural size, without being edited for comfort or social approval. This is why solitude often feels emotionally essential for people like this. It is the only place where their inner world can fully breathe without needing to become smaller than it truly is. The video emphasizes an important idea that many people misunderstand. The need for solitude is not evidence that something is wrong with you. It is not proof that you are antisocial, emotionally broken, or incapable of connection. In many cases, solitude was once an intelligent solution created by a nervous system that learned the external world did not always feel emotionally safe. For people who spent years overwhelmed by unpredictability, emotional tension, misunderstanding, or the exhausting effort of constantly adapting around others, being alone became the place where recovery was finally possible. Solitude allowed the nervous system to unclench. It allowed the mind to stop scanning, stop performing, and stop protecting itself every second. More importantly, it became the place where the most authentic parts of the self could survive intact. Inside that quiet space, many people developed deep self-reflection, emotional awareness, and a relationship with their own inner world that felt more honest than most external relationships ever did. This is why solitude often feels emotionally sacred to them. It was never simply isolation. It was protection. It was regulation. It was the mind's way of preserving stability in environments that once felt emotionally overwhelming or unsafe. The video makes it clear that solitude itself was never the enemy. In many ways, it was the very thing that helped them survive psychologically. The problem is not that they learned how to be alone. The problem is that they may have learned too early that being alone felt safer than depending on other people emotionally. The video ends with a deeply important message. There is a difference between solitude that heals you and solitude that slowly becomes a wall between you and the possibility of safe connection. At first, both can feel almost identical. Both bring relief. Both calm the nervous system. Both create distance from emotional overwhelm and exhaustion. But over time, they begin leading in very different directions. One kind of solitude helps you return to yourself so you can eventually move back toward life feeling calmer, clearer, and more emotionally grounded. The other keeps you safe from pain by keeping you safe from everything that might have healed the pain in the first place. This is the difficult part many people never fully notice. Sometimes the nervous system becomes so attached to the safety of isolation that connection itself begins to feel threatening, even when it is healthy and emotionally safe. The video emphasizes that there is nothing shameful about needing deep solitude. Some people genuinely require more emotional space in order to regulate, reflect, and feel fully themselves. That need is real and deserves respect. But at the same time, human beings are not meant to remain emotionally unseen forever. The goal is not to force yourself into constant socializing or become easier for others to handle. The goal is to slowly find relationships where your nervous system no longer has to shrink, perform, or stay guarded all the time. Relationships where your inner world can exist without being translated into something smaller. The most authentic version of you, the version that only appears in solitude, deserves more than private survival. It deserves to be seen, understood, and emotionally received by people who do not ask you to become less in order to feel loved.